Hi, welcome to Class 2 of Western Civilization Part 2, The Peoples of the Americas, from the first populations to about 1500 AD, that is, the point of widespread European contact. Today we're going to do a bit of an experiment and see if we can make up for missed classes due to weather by using some of the more modern and higher technology approaches to things back and forth. Now, let's begin. When Christopher Columbus first landed in what people call the New World, he thought he was landing on an island off the coast of Japan. In fact, where he landed was an island that was part of the archipelago of the Bahamas. We're not exactly sure which island it was, though there are many theories, but we do know it was one of that archipelago. He then went from there on to explore other islands. He visited Cuba and formed a colony on the island that he called Hispaniola, which is now divided between the island nation of Haiti and the Dominican Republic. Subsequent trips allowed him to visit other islands throughout the Caribbean, and he and later explorers found these lands to be filled with varied and vibrant peoples, a wide number of cultures, but none of them were in fact from India or China or Japan. What he had discovered was a land filled with populations unique unto themselves. Now, where did these populations come from? Well, present archaeological theory has some very, very strong ideas about how the New Worlds were occupied. And they begin by looking at the out of Africa theory, which we discussed briefly in the last course, but is focused on the migration of large populations out of Africa between 150,000 to 100,000 years ago. And those populations spread across Europe, across Asia, into Micronesia, into Australia, and then all the way across Asia and into the New Worlds via the either the land bridge that we'll discuss in a moment, or along coastal lines that were opened up by the freezing Arctic ice caps. Now, there are two main theories about how these routes were followed. Now, there's a third one too, which I'll cover very, very briefly. I covered briefly in the previous class, which is that some people suggest that they came in through a European route, but really, that's a sort of silly idea. If you look at the idea of coming across here, the only evidence for that is that the Sultrian artifact types, arrowheads, spearheads really, from Europe, have a vague similarity to those of the large game hunters of the Folsom Points and Clovis Points, which I'll be showing later, of North America. But that's a pretty weak connection back and forth. Both of these are very utilitarian types of points that are highly useful for mega game hunting. So what are the main real reasons? Why was it that people actually thought that they moved across? Well, there are two routes that are thought might have occurred. One through an ice-free corridor that you can see occurring right down the middle of this zone here, and the other is along the coastal lines coming like this. The coastal migration is believed to happen at about 20,000 years BP, that is 18,000 years BCE, or before, because the ice caps had frozen up a large amount of water and they were able to move either along icy shores or along uncovered islands down along the coast, making access and using resources that were maritime in nature. And there's some elements that suggest this. Some of the earlier dates of objects and populations that we have found suggest that this earlier 20,000 or earlier date may have been there. And once they moved past the ice sheets, they were able to move into the interiors of North America and then down also into Mesoamerica and South America. The other theory, the older of the two theories, is that they went across an ice-free corridor at about 14,000 BCE. This is what's referred to often as the Bering Land Strait. You can see here that the waters, again, because all of the water was held up in ice caps, opened up a avenue straight through the frozen tundras, as it were, and then along a narrow corridor between the Laurentide ice sheet and the Cordilleran ice sheet that allowed them to go straight into the continents. Now, this is the older theory of the two, but there is no reason why these are not both possible. Indeed, you could well have had an earlier population move along the coastal migration and then a later population move also along in through the ice-free corridor. Well, what this left open, what this became, was allowing a population to move in that we now refer to as Paleo-Indian. Paleo meaning old, Indian coming from the old concept that this handed down from Columbus, that the population had originally been Indians, that is from the subcontinent of India. We, as you all know, have often referred to as Native Americans, indigenous Americans, as Indians. Well, this is a sort of nomenclature that calls back to that. And here we have evidence of what we call the Clovis culture, dating to between 11,000 and 10,000 BP. That is, BP stands before present. That's the same as about 9,000 to about 8,000 BCE, that is before the Common Era, or BC, before Christ, depending on how you want to break it down. But these populations use these large points ideally suited for hunting megafauna and things such as that. And this is a typical Clovis or Paleo-Indian toolkit. It would include large scrapers, such as you have over here. You have your beautiful Clovis point here, two of them. Notice how large they are. Those are not arrowheads. Those are meant for going on the edge of large spears. You have other tools meant for making tools such as this, knapping flints, scraping. Here's a knife blade. Here's a scraper, ideal for removing flesh from hide. All sorts of very interesting and useful tools for this population. And here are some of the examples of the animals that they would have most likely hunted. Now, these were not pure hunters. They were hunters and gatherers. They'd combined their food sources by gathering different vegetable sources, root vegetables, what have you, as well as large game hunting. And some of the large game they hunted from that time were things such as the ancient camels, seen here over here on the right of the screen, the mastodon, large elephants that were common to the North America and South American plains at that time period, and things such as the giant sloth we have over here, which was actually a very formidable creature, not nearly as slow or ponderous as some of their earlier animals. And of course, there were the mammoths, the great woolly mammoths that they hunted as well. Now, the image of these guys as hunters going up against a large, massive hunting animal is quite fascinating. You know, a handful of hunters trying to kill a giant elephant is always an exciting image. However, a lot of our evidence shows that they had much more cunning techniques. They would do things such as ambush them, or one of the classic techniques that we have some evidence of is they would set fire to a large amount of grasslands before a cliff and sort of drive these elephants off the edge of the cliff where they'd fall to their death. They'd then go down and kill them and butcher them. Not being able to take the entire herd, we'd find large numbers of them left behind to rot because they just could not take the entire amount of animal. This is a very common technique found in both the Old and New worlds at that time. So, in summary, the initial settlement of the Americas, both North and South, probably occurred along the coastline, exploiting maritime resources, and then subsequent populations could well have gone in through the ice-free corridors down through the central zones there. The populations in the Americas became more visibly archaeologically after 1300 BP, that is about 13,000 BP rather. That's about 13,000 years ago. Now, what's important is to remember that we don't know if that's because the population started to increase at that time, or because of the receding ice sheets, we have more evidence of them surviving at that time. You see, as the ice sheets began to recede, then preservation of their artifacts becomes more common. It's at about that point we come across what we call the Paleo-Indian culture, and that's followed by the Archaic periods in North America, starting between about 10,000 and 8,000 BCE, depending on the region. Now, we don't have time to go into all the details of this. Indeed, the study of North American archaeology is a class all unto itself. I took courses in North American native populations that would take an entire course as an undergraduate course. Indeed, each of the three main parts of this class are classes that I took as whole courses into themselves. What we will look at, though, is giving you a general idea of what the populations were like at the time of contact and how they got there. Now, one of the most important things to remember about the colonization and initial settlement of North America by the Native American populations was the domestication of maize, which is what we call corn. And that began about 8,700 years ago. That's about 6,700 years BC or BCE, depending on how you want to talk about it. And it began with a plant called teosinte, which is a native indigenous plant that just grew in the area. And you can see the size of their kernels based on this little picture here that shows a American quarter sitting next to what is the ear of the fruit, the seed that came out of it, the kernels of corn. Now, it was a slow process. This was not as quick as the domestication of grains by the Europeans, and more importantly by the Mesopotamians, because it is a harder grain to domesticate. It takes more planning. You actually have to plan it out rather than the sort of accident with the brittle rachis that occurred with the other plants, with the grains and things like that. But what eventually happened is that in the Balsas region of central Mexico, we get the domestication of corn. That is, that people start planting corn and it grows larger and larger and becomes a more and more important part of their food source. Now, this set the stage for much larger scale civilizations to appear in Mesoamerica. And by 1500 BCE, we start getting evidence of sedentism. That means people living in the same location for long periods, and early true agriculture in place. We get corn, that is maize. We get beans, squash, chili, and domesticated cotton, all not just being used, but being heavily relied upon. We see the rise of pottery. Pottery is being made by people, though it's not yet specialized. You don't have specialized potters. You do instead have people making potteries. And lithics are developing to a very high degree. That means stone tools are becoming very, very sophisticated. But at this stage, there's not yet any sign of real social differentiation. What you're seeing instead is a more or less what appears to be egalitarian society. That is to say that maybe there are leaders and people who are followers, but we cannot see any real class system evolving at this point. Now that all starts to change shortly after this. You start getting larger settlements forming, and large earthen pyramids and platforms starting to appear, and the building of large stone sculptures, so that by 1200 you get the beginnings of what we call the Olmec culture. Now the Olmecs, you can see, were located here just around central Mexico along the coast of the Gulf of Mexico. And they are one of the earliest societies that we find that really can begin to be called a civilization in the Americas. Now they grew strongest between 1200 and 500 BC. So that's just about the same time as we start seeing, say, cultures such as the Mycenaeans occurring in Greece. They were an agricultural people. That is to say, they relied on agriculture. They didn't just use it as a form of supplementing their diet, but they used it as the prime form of feeding their diet. And really, we don't know that much about their civilization. One of the reasons we don't know so much about their civilization is because the climate there makes preservation very, very difficult. So it's very hard to unwind what we know. We now believe that they had been made up of several smaller groups, but originally we thought it was one large sort of empire or kingdom. That doesn't seem to be the case. In fact, what we seem to see are a series of what we might call city-states that had shared cultural exchange and shared cultural traits. And they're often associated with their large stone head sculptures. You can see in these pictures how big these stone head sculptures are, and they're very unique features. See how they're very full-faced, full-featured individuals. They also had a large number of hollow baby ceramics, which share this sort of feature. It's very interesting to see lots of theories as are these heads really babies? Did they worship babies? There's lots of bizarre theories out there, but we don't really know. What we do know is that they had these large stone heads with somewhat full features, and they used a lot of the ceramics of hollow baby ceramics. And they had several cultural traits that are distinctive, that became highly important to later cultures such as the Mayans and the Aztecs and other groups that all tended to tie their origins back to the Olmecs. Now, one of the classic Olmec sites is La Venta, and here you can see how Olmec sites tended to be laid out. They are set out as a linear pattern. You can see up in the upper picture that they are set between a large mounded pyramid-like structure that leads down a central avenue with different platforms in it and leads then to a palisaded zone in front of what one might call a central pyramid. And again, you get pyramids here as in Asia. Now, why pyramids? I'm going to cover this briefly for those of you who did not take the previous course. Pyramids have several advantages as features. First of all, they look like mountains. Secondly, and perhaps most importantly, they are one of the readily built stable structures that you can build. If you were to build a straight wall structure like this, you need to have internal supports or flying buttresses on the outside to hold up the structure. But if you steep it in, then the structure itself is more inherently stable. Try building a sand castle. If you just take sand and pile it up, you're going to end up with sort of a mound. Same thing as a mountain or things like that. These are inherently stable structures. So you often see cultures beginning architectural structural constructs using pyramids because they are a very straightforward and easily stable structure to build. Now, what else can we say about the Olmecs? Well, they developed a very wide trade network based in part on extremely high quality obsidian. Obsidian that was locally available to them, but not locally available to all the other populations. So they could exchange this obsidian in return for other goods. And each city appears to have been independent, though they had inter-city connections and cultural connections. So each one was its own little kingdom, as it were, its own little city-state, but with overall interactions between them. Now by 400 BC, the Olmec sites become abandoned. This has led to what people call the Olmec disappearance and some very interesting conspiracy theories. Now, the majority of the population at that time decreased between 400 and 350 BC. And what we do know about this time period is rather than there being space aliens taking them away or them ascending into a comet, we do know that there's drastic evidence of environmental changes. There are changes in the ways the rivers moved across the landscape. This heavily impacted agriculture, hunting, and gathering. And it's thought to have been due to tectonic activity and maybe some volcanism at the time. In other words, there was a lot of earthquakes and volcanoes, and that changed the patterns by which the rivers went. And once those changed, well then, the crop systems began to fail. Animals went to different hunting areas. Gathering could not be done locally in the same place it was before. And so the food sources dried up. So at that point, the people began to abandon their cities. Now, that's just one theory. There are numerous others. But regardless of the reasons, the culture that was created by the Olmec didn't just totally disappear. Instead, it dramatically influenced those other cultures around it and those that followed. And one of the most important cultures that followed are the ones we call the Mayans, just down the coast in what we now refer to as Central America. That is up in the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico and down into Guatemala, Honduras, and other Central American states. Now, the Mayan population is different time periods that it's associated with. And the pre-classic period, that is from 2500 BC to 250 AD, so you'll note there is some overlap with the Olmecs there. We see what happens from the rise of the earliest agricultural villages and the first written dates, so they started developing writing and timekeeping at that time. You see the rise of temple structures, very small to begin with, at about 800 BC, and larger centers like El Mirador coming in at around 400 BC. You get the growth of different social networks occurring, and you get social differentiation. That is to say, you start getting the appearance of what seems to be a class system with elites at the top and divine kingships, that is, kings who are thought to be related to the gods. You also get the flourishing of blood rituals during this time period, bloodletting as offerings to the gods. Now, what's interesting is, unlike, say, the later Aztec populations, these blood rituals were not so much based on sacrifices of common people or captives to the gods, but rather blood sacrifices of the leaders. They would do things such as take stingray spines and pull them through their tongues or their genitalia, letting blood out and sacrificing their own blood for the good of the population. And you see throughout this time period a growth in the population, large urban centers develop, and the localization of centers of power across the area. Now, following the pre-classic, you get the middle pre-classic, or the Nakabe culture. And this is where you start seeing the development of fascinating stonework structures. This is around 600 to 400 BC. And You'll note here, even though these structures you're seeing here are over 2,500 years old, the stonework still survives. These are just standard housing structures you're seeing here, not a high temple. But there you can see the stone in the harshest of all survival environments, that of a jungle, starts to appear and maintains itself despite the incredible difficult nature of keeping these things together under such jungle conditions. Now, at this time, we start getting larger urban centers, such as the one shown here. There you see stonework structures such as these, large temples and town-like buildings coming together in a urban center or proto-urban center centered on ritual and elaborate display of both elites and religious centers. Now, across the region at this time, you begin to get extensive trade networks. You get things such as salt and jade and cacao, that's chocolate, obsidian and cotton and feathers, basalt, ceramics, all sorts of highly important goods. Honey, very important form of calories coming in, being traded across the region between these more or less independent city-states. That creates a very important exchange system and transportation of ideas and ideologies, a change of ideologies, an exchange of ideologies. People begin talking to each other, sharing ideas, following similar ideas back and forth. Now, after this, very shortly, possibly partially due to this sort of growing exchange network, you get the growth of true cities appearing. In the north, up in the north of the Yucatan Peninsula, you get Chichen Itza, which is an amazing location. If you ever have a chance to see it, go there. In central Yucatan, you get Tikal and many other sites. And in Honduras, you get Copan. So you get the growth of these major cities, major centers of these exchange systems beginning to appear. The other cities, the other civilizations, the other towns, the other small cities can continue to exist, but here you start getting the growth of these major cities centering, or with the others focusing in on them. And you get the creation of what we now associate as the classic Mayan structures, architecture, and the use of space as a form of social organization. Here is a classic pyramid. We're going to talk about the nature of the pyramids in just a minute, but look at how that pyramid is formed. It is very steep. Now note it maintains its structure by having a considerable step construction that makes it innately more stable. It goes up a little bit on one side, up, where's my hand? Up a little bit on one side, a slight slope, sits over, up more on a side, slips over, etc. But also notice those steps right in the front of it. Those are not steps that you can walk up in an upright position. In order to safely go up them, you kind of have to crawl. It's almost more like a ladder. So there's a built-in supplication to get from the base of the pyramid, where the population in general is, to the top of the pyramid, where the rituals are taking place and the priest kings are holding their rituals. They also begin using central core of stone architecture. So all about them, they start building these courtyards of highly elaborate stone structures laid out in very organized and stable cities and city-like layouts. And you get elite housing, such as the one shown here, with these courtyards. And then the further out you get, the more you get more common housing as well. Now on to the pyramids. These served as temples where sacrifices such as the bloodletting we discussed earlier would be occurring at the very top. There'd also be astronomical observations being taken place there. But inside the pyramid itself, it also served as a funerary monument, because these are priest kings who tie their divinity to their original god state. And so inside each of these, there are elaborate tomb systems that go down into the inner zone. And we have bodies found inside of the tombs down in the lower zones down here. So they serve both as pyramids of monuments, of funerary monuments, I should say, and as temples. And to that end, they also reproduce the social structure of the priest kings who overlooked the population. And as it goes forward, you see more and more elaborate cities built around a variety of these pyramids with palace states around. If you can see the pyramids, they're self-evident. If you see those lower buildings with numerous courtyards, those are palaces where either the priests, the priest kings, the nobles, populations like that would live. Now, the Mayans also developed a very complex writing system. And those are found as inscriptions, in part, on stelae, that is, large stone structures that are put out in front of things, like the Code of Hammurabi was, the stelae in which the laws in Mesopotamia were written. Well, here there are stelae with histories and populations written, histories of the populations and divine stories written, placed out in central places. They also wrote on the buildings themselves. There was elaborate carvings that used their writing system. Their writing system was a glyph-based system. Similar to hieroglyphics, they had very stylized imagery. Sometimes that imagery is used to make it look like those are aliens, but if you study the way the system developed, you can see very clearly the evolution of how the writing goes from being something that is very clearly a person with, say, a bird in their hand into a stylized image. They also wrote on frescoes. And there are beautiful frescoes found throughout the area. If you go into some of these temples, you can see the amazing color combinations that have survived inside some of these structures. And they were used in codices, that is to say, books. They had written books where they would place these hieroglyphs and give the entire tales of the gods, of the histories of the villages, and things like that. Now, many of these codices did not survive the conquest. Many of them deteriorated on their own, but many, many still exist, and they have actually been translated because the population of the Mayans still exists today. And somewhere along the line, the son of one of the sort of famous archaeologists who had grown up pretty much amongst the population of local Mayans began to look at these images and said, hey, wait, I know what this says, because he actually spoke the local dialect. And once he did that, they were able to uncode many, many of these Mayan codices. The Mayan calendar also gets a lot of attention, and for good reason. It is a fascinating combination of both a lunar calendar and a solar calendar. So it has a 260-day lunar-based calendar that works almost in a gear-like relationship to the 365-day solar calendar that is the basis of the orbit of the Earth around the Sun. 260 days is a lunar calendar watching the orbit of the moon around the Earth. Together, they create a 52-year calendar, which is what's referred to as the long count. And when they align at different times, different things are supposed to have happened. For example, in 2012, the world ended and we all died. Well, that's the way some people refer to it. According to Mayan cultures, great events would occur, great changes would occur, but that didn't necessarily mean the world was really ending. But then, at around 750 to 900 AD, so this is just about sort of the time of, say, the rise of the Vikings in Europe and the rise of Charlemagne and the beginning of the Holy Roman Empire and of Francia, you begin to get changes occurring in Mayan civilization. First of all, people stop building major construction projects. The monuments stop being built, and the long count stops being used. The last long count date we have, the last time we have it written down and calculated out, was in 850 AD. After that, no one else seemed to be calculating the long count anymore. What is clear is that a lot of the kings lost their political power. The centralization of these priest kings began to fall apart. And we get the depopulation of large urban centers. So the kings start losing power and people start moving away from the big population centers. This is what's referred to as the collapse period of 900 AD. Many sites are abandoned at this time, and populations generally move from large cities to much smaller communities that are spread throughout the jungle areas. Some cities continue to be lived in, but it's a tiny remnant population living in the core of the city rather than a whole city the way it used to be. Now, in some locations, some of the cities continue to flourish for a brief time period, but for the most part, what we see is the depopulation of big cities and the collapse of these city-states run by kings. And it's thought that this might all be tied to environmental changes. You see, at that time, we do know there were long periods of extended drought. Exactly why this drought occurred, we're not exactly sure. One of the key thoughts, though, is that there was an agricultural depletion of the soil. That is to say that the massive agriculture needed to sustain these giant cities started to deplete the fairly thin soil of the area of its enrichment. Now, one thing to remember is that most of the area of the Yucatan and Honduras is a fairly thin soil base on top of limestone. Now, limestone is very porous, so when water falls on it, it doesn't tend to accumulate. Instead, it tends to wash down. So if you have a drought, it hits pretty hard. If you are also in the process of sort of depleting the soils by using up the nutrients in them, that also breaks down the ability of that thin surface layer to hold water, as well as reduce the quantities and qualities of the crops you get. So that leads to what's referred to as the post-classic period. And it's when the high point of Mayan culture sort of ends. For the most part, urban centers are abandoned. The populations move to smaller settlements, and the Mayans are sometimes said to disappear. But that's nonsense, because the Mayans are there today. They still live there, and they still speak related languages. As I said before, that's how we were able to uncode the codexes, is that people started actually talking to the population. Oh my goodness, talk to the population that's there. Maybe they know something about their own past. Anyways, the Mayans did not disappear. They just simply went and changed their habitation style from living in big cities that were no longer agriculturally or economically viable into smaller communities throughout the landscape. And now that leads us to talk about the next area, and that is the highland zone. If you want to take a break now, this is a good time to probably pause, go get a drink, go to the bathroom, something like that. I'm not going to stop talking because you got a pause button on here anyways, but this is how it works. The highland zones were in central Mexico. And there were a series of cultures there that really each deserve a long examination, but we just don't have time. They include the Zapotec state, Teotihuacan, which was a massive, massive city built with enormous pyramids. Amazing location to go look at, and well worth studying if you have the chance. But they had an incredible, important concept here, and later cultures often thought that this was where the world began. You got the rise of the Toltec population, who were a very warlike population that lived throughout the central highland zones and had a lot of wars back and forth. And eventually you get what's called the Mexica population, which we're going to spend a little more time talking about. Now, the Toltecs had a warlike state population, but that sort of began to break down a bit. And around 1200 to 1250 AD, so just about the time of the Crusades, to give you an idea, there was a population from the north of Mexico that wandered down towards the Central Valley of Mexico, the Mexica. Now, many populations were moving in at this point because the Central Valley had sort of growing wealth and had sort of a promise of things going on there. Now, the Mexica were definitely a warrior people, and they quickly allied themselves and became vassals. Does everybody remember what vassals are? That is, people who work for somebody else, who pledge allegiance to somebody else. But they became vassals to one of the dominant Toltec-descended cities of the time period. And they were very clever. They worked basically as mercenaries fighting around for these people. And they began to intermarry with their liege lords and adopt many of their cultural traits. And then, at around 1323 AD, the Mexica proved to be an incredibly important military asset to that population. They were involved in a major battle. And so they were greatly appreciated by their lord, and their lord said, well, I'll grant you a boon. And they asked their lord in return for his daughter, so that they could provide her with a great honor to be put upon her and the population as whole. Now, that brings us to the Mexica god, known as the Red Tezcatlipoca, Zipetotec. He is associated with springtime and the east, and with farming, and he brings with the spring, he renews himself, and much like a corn bursting out of its husk, he bursts out of his skin. He's sometimes, in fact, called the flayed god. And he does this by flaying himself of his old skin and emerging in a new skin. Well, guess what the honor was that they decided to bestow upon the daughter of their liege lord. So imagine this great festival, a wonderful feast with great celebration going on and cocoa being served and various other things. And then the high point comes, and out comes the high priest of the Mexica, dressed in the flayed skin of their lord's daughter. Needless to say, this didn't go down very well with their liege lord. And it led to a series of bloody battles where the Mexica were driven basically all around the Valley of Mexico, up and down through Puebla, all over the place, until they were eventually forced to settle inside of a swamp in Lake Texcoco, where they founded a city that they called Tenochtitlan. Now, Tenochtitlan was again in the middle of the swamp. It made it very easily defendable. But what they did was also very clever. They built a series of man-made islands and canals to make this lake navigable, and so that they could move food in and out all around the city itself. They also would be able to have water-based crops, so that they would let water in with fertile soil, sort of refertilize the ground of their islands, and then they could plant fresh crops. It was very clever. And as the city grew, they began to make more and more political alliances and military alliances. And exchange systems, and they got into a lot of wars, a whole lot of wars. And the Mexica became known to later populations as the Aztec. In fact, Mexica is the Nahuatl name for Aztec, and it's from which the Mexica, the word Mexico, comes. Now, the Mexica, the Aztecs, grew to dominate first the Valley of Mexico and then later Mexico as a whole. And this resulted in a very despotic empire, one with a heavy class-based system that was top-heavy and very, very, well, as I said, despotic, very, very totalitarian in its nature. Now, the Aztec Empire grew based on three fundamental principles. The first was diplomacy and alliances. They formed a triple alliance with two other states, Texcoco and Tlacopan. The Aztecs in Tenochtitlan began as an equal in this, but very quickly they became dominant over this triple alliance, and they were really the top of it. The second thing they did was create an elaborate exchange and commerce system. And this is a commerce system in some ways much more modern than many other things we see in the Americas at the time period. They did use a barter system where an item was exchanged for another item, but it focused on local marketplaces centered near the temples where sacrifices were made. They traded food and ceramics and raw materials and prestige items, things like cocoa, jade, gold, silver, stuff like that, all crucial for social display, for noble elites, and for sacrifice. Now, this was all done with no domesticated animals. Remember, there were no domesticated animals in North America at that time. All the animals were too small for that. Only later do you get horses, and you get those because they escaped from Spanish and French explorers and conquistadores. They are not native to North America. So all merchant classes, all objects for trade had to be carried on the back of someone or floated down a canal. Now, this created a class of merchants that were very powerful middle class. They're definitely below the nobles, but they were significantly above commoners. And it also led to the creation of a warfare state, a state where warfare was used to create and maintain elite status inside the society. Now, the Aztecs began to rule as sovereigns over an empire of vassal states, vassals that they conquered and made them pay tribute in the forms of gold and cocoa and stuff like that, as well as human sacrifices, because the Aztecs did have a very bloody-based religion. They also kept pocket kingdoms. You can see them illustrated in the white areas inside the otherwise green Aztec zone. Now, these pocket kingdoms existed primarily so that they could be attacked, so that a warrior elite status could be maintained. You have to have wars in order to have a warrior elite, and also so that sacrifices could be captured and used to sacrifice on the gods. As a result, warfare became a means of social reproduction. The warrior classes were very important to the Aztecs. Aztec culture had a very strong series of strict castes. Families could move up in these castes, but primarily the surest way to go up was to show valor in combat. So in order to keep social mobility going and have the lower classes invested in the upper classes and in the maintaining of society, they had to have constant warfare. And to keep this open, they needed to have little vassal states and little independent states, pocket empires, they could go and beat up on a regular basis. Their warfare was also tied to their ritual beliefs because it fed back into social reproduction, and you had to have sacrifices in order to maintain good relations with the gods and, in fact, to keep the world going. In the Aztec view, these human sacrifices were very beneficial. They were doing a good thing because without them, the world would end. Now, the Aztec religion is extremely complex, but you can say there are 6 more or less key central deities that we can talk about. The first is Quetzalcoatl, the white Tezcatlipoca, associated with the West. He is the god of light and mercy and the wind and education. He's also usually portrayed either as a feathered serpent, you've probably seen that, or as a man depicted in like pure white painting. Then there is the blue Tezcatlipoca, my Nahuatl is not very good, Huitzilopochtli, who is the war god, the southern one, and he is the god of war. Then there's Zipitotec, the red Tezcatlipoca, who we've already talked about, the god of farming and gold and springtide, the flayed god we discussed earlier. And then there is Tezcatlipoca himself, the black Tezcatlipoca, the god associated with the north, also known as smoking mirror. He is the god of judgment, of night, deceit, sorcery, and the earth. Now, other gods included Tlaloc, the rain god, who had sort of a fish-like face and whose power was seen to go in a sort of constant cycle. Rain would come down, go into the earth, run underground, and then come up over into the oceans and begin the cycle again. And then there's Tonatiuh, the sun god. Now this was the god who required human hearts to power him in order to keep the sun burning. Now this is a great ceremony because what they would do is they would take a person, they'd have a competition, and whoever won the competition got to be sacrificed on top of the pyramid. And they do this by cutting him open, removing his heart, and then starting a fire in his chest cavity. And if you couldn't start the fire in the chest cavity, then the sun wouldn't keep burning and the world would end. So, very, very beneficial. And that's what happens to the winner. I don't really know what happened to the loser. Now, each of the Aztec gods was important, particularly those mentioned, but Quetzalcoatl ends up playing a particularly important role in what happened next. You see, Quetzalcoatl was portrayed as a human and also as a feathered serpent, and his image is tied across Mesoamerican iconography. He goes back to Teotihuacan and to Cholula. There are images of him that far predate the Aztec population. And as said before, he was also referred to as the white Tezcatlipoca. He was tied to the planet Venus, to the dawn, to merchants and arts and crafts and knowledge. He was the patron god of the Aztec priesthood and of learning and of mercy. Now, why do I bring this up? Well, hold on, you'll see. Because in 1519, Montezuma II became the king of the Aztecs. That's also the year that Hernan Cortez arrived from Spain with about 11 ships, 500 men, only 13 horses, and a very small number of cannons. Now, what Cortez did was very, very clever. He landed and he allied with the local indigenous populations. For the most part, they were kind of happy to see them and to rise up against their Aztec overlords, because in case you haven't gathered, it wasn't necessarily the best thing to be a vassal to the Aztecs. They were pretty harsh overlords. And so Cortez, with this growing body of people behind him, marched towards Tenochtitlan with a troop of his forces, plus allies that grew larger and larger along the route, because he released prisoners as he went along the way. He gave words of peace and told people to follow him. all playing very much into perhaps what might be beginning to be a familiar pattern to you. Montezuma II deliberately let Cortez enter Tenochtitlan. For one thing, he had this huge, massive following behind him, but secondly, he was hoping to learn more about these strangers and their weaknesses. There were rumors that they might actually be gods, so he needed to find out more about these people. And he gave them lavish gifts of gold, which really only encouraged the Spanish to ask for more gold, and in fact, to plunder more, because that's what they were there for. They were there for gold. Now, when Cortez learned of a pretty minor attack on the coast, he used it as an excuse to take Montezuma hostage. Now, in 1520, after Montezuma was held captive for a while, he was killed. Now, the Spaniards say he was stoned to death by his own people. Whether or not that's true, it's hard to say. Victors write the histories. But what that did lead to is the Spanish hightailing it out of the city and then turning around and sieging Tenochtitlan and smashing it with their cannons and with their allies. They razed the city to the ground. They destroyed it and thus ended the Aztec Empire. Now, there are a couple of interesting stories about Hernan Cortez, particularly his possibility as being seen as Quetzalcoatl. And there are some scholars that argue that Cortez was viewed as the re-embodiment of Quetzalcoatl. First of all, because he was a white man, and as I said before, Quetzalcoatl was seen as the white Tezcatlipoca. Secondly, he arrived in a giant boat with sails, something the likes of which the Aztecs hadn't seen before. The Aztecs had giant war canoes, but this is something different, these giant ships with sails. Secondly, he did something very clever, which is he did not allow his cavalry to ever dismount in front of the locals. The locals had never seen horses or any beasts of burden, so when they saw these, they didn't know whether these were men on horseback or some sort of centaur-like beast, the likes of which they'd never heard. So the question becomes, how is it that this handful of men managed to conquer the millions that were there? And some people say that Hernan Cortez played up the association between himself and Quetzalcoatl, and that Montezuma and many of the other population thought that he was in fact the embodiment of that god. Now, others note that there is no evidence of a resurrected Quetzalcoatl before the Spanish arrival, and that likely this is a Christian conversion myth that was added later. So all of this Hernan Cortez as Quetzalcoatl is a pipe dream of historians. But either way, it makes for an interesting tale and worth considering as a possibility. And so at that point, the Aztecs and Mexico were conquered. But that leads us now on the road to the Incas. And again, if you want to take a break, this is probably a very good time to do it. Now, what can we talk about the Incas? The Incas were located in the Andes and were the last of a series of state-level societies that had developed. You can see here in this picture the core area of the Incan civilization, though in fact what we do know is that the Incans went further south and further north at their high point. And this shows the limit of the Incan Empire, based first in the Cusco Valley, depicted in the center here and shown by that tiny little red space at the center, and then their different areas of conquest over what was a very short time period. But the way they were able to do these conquests was not just because of their own brilliance, though they did have a certain degree of brilliance involved in this, but also because they were not the first state-based society in the Andes. Now, early Andean cultures, like just about everywhere else, were hunter-gatherers to begin with. They probably lived in bands that would move up and down and across the zones, and they inhabited wide range of ecosystems across the western coast of South America. These ranged from barren deserts along the coasts themselves to high-altitude mountains to the forested jungles on the eastern slopes of the Andes. And how these populations, these hunter-gatherers, changed into more sedentary, quote-unquote, complex civilizations is highly debated. And we will discuss that in brief. Now, the foundations of Andean civilization are believed to be due to one of two main competing theories. One of those theories says that it was a maritime foundation. That is to say that coastal cultures were the first to develop into proto-urban centers and then into state-level societies. And that they relied primarily on maritime resources, resources such as anchovy paste and shellfish and things like that, because sea-based resources are very, very rich, and that is what formed the core of the initial Andean civilization. Now, the more classic model for the core foundation of Andean civilization comes from an agricultural model. This is the traditional model by which people say things happened, and that suggests that Andean civilizations originated due to the use of domesticates, particularly the potatoes, which were domesticated between 7,000 and 5,000 BC. Quinoa, yes, that food that we love to use for all sorts of hipster-type meals, that was developed between 2,000 and 1,000 BCE and is a very important staple. And then llamas and alpacas were domesticated in the Andes between 2,500 and 1,800 BC. So all of these things lead some people to think that the agriculture was the foundation of what became Andean civilizations, while others think that there's evidence of Andean civilizations primarily forming along the maritime routes. Regardless of which zone started these processes, there were numerous civilizations that formed in South America during these time periods. And then, as I said before, this is a course totally on its own. I'm going to go shooting through it. You have different periods, such as the initial period, 2,500 to 200 BC, the intermediate period, which we'll focus a little bit more on, between 200 and 600 AD, and then, of course, the Incan period, which follows thereafter, and we'll spend a little more time on that. Now, the intermediate period had several cultures that developed inside of it. The Moche, such as we see here, between 200 BC and 600 AD, you can see occurred in the northern zone, and they had these large stone and earthen pyramid structures that are associated with them. The Tiwanaku, between 600 and 1200 AD, did not use stone pyramids, but instead used very elaborate hand-carved stonework. Note, there's no mortar used in any of these stones. In fact, they are fit together with perfect geometry, cut and matched to fit together like an enormous jigsaw puzzle with highly elaborate carvings inside of each. Then there's the Huari, called Wari often in English, but really the Huari, 500 to 1100 AD. This population, which you can see coexisted with the previous culture. You see the previous culture is written in blue down here. Purple is the Huari. They had another culture that existed with long road systems that were lined with walls and structures and things like that. Their stonework not quite as sophisticated, but certainly going on for exceptionally long stretches here, there, and the other place. The Chimu, between 1000 and 1470 AD, were another population that were centered in Chanchan. And here you see they had elaborate wall structures with this very interesting conical or actually almost diamond-shaped cone-type wall constructions into which things would be placed, and elaborate carvings as well. So as you see, there's a long, long history of state-level civilizations occurring before we get to the Incan Empire. Now, the Incan Empire based itself on taking over other cultures and utilizing and adopting an awful lot of what they did. And you can see here that between the years of 1438, where they begin as this tiny little zone of red, and 1532, less than 100 years later, they have spread all the way up and down the entire west coast of South America. That is a feat that even the Romans would have bowed at in impression. And they did so by taking over the different cultures they came across. Now, who then were the Incas? Well, the Incas were called after the Sapa Inca, that is, the king Inca, who is considered to be a divine descendant of Viracocha, the sun god. He was considered the true king, and they had a very interesting and elaborate inheritance system, which we'll be getting to in just a little bit. The Incas were also an ethnic group, that is, those populations, those people that came out of Cusco. No one who was not part of that original Cusco population was ever considered a true Inca. When we also refer to Incas, we also refer to their art style, which was distinctive, particularly their fabric work. And at last, we also refer to their empire, the Incan Empire. Now, the growth of the Incan territories was lightning fast. The Pachacutic period, that initial growth from the valley of Cusco, that red bit in the center, to that purple bit right outside of it, took about 30 years, a little bit less than that, and they grew very quickly and took over that zone. Then they moved northward into the Tupac Inca, which again they took over in about a 50-year period. And then finally, they moved south and took over a vast sway of population in the Huayna Capac time period, that between 1493 and 1525. So in a very, very short amount of time, they grew to overtake these different cultural regions across the Andes. All from the small valley of Cusco, where they grew and built a large city. Now, something to recognize about the Incas is that they utilized a lot of the technologies that had come before them. For example, their stonework. Look at the massive size of these stone blocks, hand-carved, so tight together that you cannot fit a piece of paper in between them. That's a little boy you see there. So that gives you an idea of how big these stone blocks are. And that they took from some of their predecessors. And how were they organized? Well, at the top, there was the Sapa Inca, that is, the Incan emperor. And below him were the noble classes, such as the Villac Uma, that is the high priest. He is a very important character. Priests were incredibly important. This was a quasi-theological state. And below him were the royal family. Now, this is very important because inheritance in amongst the Incas was very different from the way we've seen it before. In order to try to avoid conflict between people chosen to be king and their relatives who might also want to be king, the Incas came up with a fascinating system. They had the eldest son or the chosen son in this case, become the Sapa Inca. But all of the goods belonging to the previous Sapa Inca went to the rest of their family. So you were king, but you had no money, whereas the rest of your family was put up in a pretty easy life for the rest of their lives. The same was true for the general Inca noble classes, descendants of the first inhabitants of Cusco. They also had, whoever was the noble would receive the title, but their family would receive the wealth. And this created a need for different populations to move forward, a need to keep conquering. Because if the Sapa Inca and the noble Incas were to gain wealth enough to support the style of life in their courts that they needed to have in order to remain in power, they needed to conquer other lands and add them to their own population. Now, below the actual Incas were people who were considered Inca by privilege, that is, sort of honorary Incas who were ascended to sort of this position of being almost real people based on their service or their marriage or things like that. Now, below these classes of noble classes, there were public administrators. There were the curacas, who were local leaders from subjected populations. These are people who would be made leaders and said, okay, you're in charge of this region, rule them in our name. And of course, they were kept a very close eye on. Below them were the tax collectors, obviously important in any society. The record keepers, who we'll talk about in just a minute, because the Incas had a fascinating way of keeping records. And below them, the artisans, the people who made things. And of course, at the bottom, the farmers, because God knows people who are farmers are always at the bottom of the societies. Now, the Incan elites were considered to be divine. They were descended from the gods, particularly from Viracocha, sort of the sun god. They had a very hierarchical structure and a clear-cut ethnic identity. In order to be an Inca, you had to come from Cusco. You had to directly tie your line to Cusco. But they were clever as well because they created marriage alliances inside the populations they conquered. So they may well have only allowed people descended from Cusco to become Incas, but they would marry into elite families elsewhere, and so those families would then become Inca by descent as well. So you could maintain or grow your power based on marriage alliances. Now, key to much of what is seen as the Incan Empire is textiles. They traded in textiles. Textiles in many ways were seen almost as a form of money, and they had very elaborate and beautiful textile styles. This is an existing one. It doesn't look as shockingly beautiful as it is because, after all, it's 1,000 years old and was in a cave for most of that time. But it is an amazing piece of woven textile. They also maintained elaborate exchange networks, tying together their different regions, both from the north to the south of their empire, but also in the vertical slopes of their empire. Because do not forget, the Incans didn't just live in a north-south empire, but they lived in one with different climates based on their altitude. In the coastal zones, there was desert and maritime resources. As you moved up, you had more temperate climate. As you got very high, you had almost frozen climate. And then down on the other side of the Incas, of the Andes, you began to get jungle zones. So they had cultural differences between the north and the south, and climactic differences on a vertical slope. And they, in order to tie this all together, developed one of the most amazing road systems the world has ever seen. Here you can see some of them, not just across the land as it goes, but also the bridges that had to be built to cross the enormous chasms that exist in the height of the Andes Mountains. Now, unlike what happened in North America and Mesoamerica, in the Andes there were draft animals. There were llamas and alpacas. And they were used along these roads to connect the lowland and highland exchange. Now, what was most important about the lowland and highland exchange is the different goods that existed at each of the different altitudes. At one altitude, at the higher altitudes, you would have potatoes, wool, and dried llama meat that could be used for exchange. Lower down, you had maize, that is corn, faba beans, salt, always important for preservation, and coca. And then down on the coastlands, of course, you had seafoods. Now, each llama could carry about 100 pounds per animal, which is obviously a lot more than a normal human can carry, which is about 50 pounds per animal. The Incas also helped to develop existing agricultural practices into something that was a lot more sustainable. They created a terraced form of agriculture that allowed them to intensify the amount of land available for agriculture along these great slopes. As you can see, they would create terraces that could be farmed along these different levels. 1 terrace, 2 terrace, 3 terrace, that sort of thing. A fantastic ability to turn what would have been unusable slope into highly usable agricultural land. And then what they used this agriculture for was based on the altitude. At some altitudes, you got quinoa, which you see up in the top of the picture. In others, you got potatoes. That's that middle picture. And then you also got maize at the lower ones. Now, notice something interesting about all of these, which is the vast amount of color you see here. If you look at quinoa in the store, for the most part, you get white quinoa. Sometimes you get red quinoa, but that's about it. Here you see that there are lots of different types of quinoa, lots of colors. Potatoes in the middle. Have you ever seen that variety of potatoes in a grocery store? Well, here in the Andes, there was a vast variety of potatoes, as well as corn. Maize shown down at the bottom. Now, the colors are more than just an aesthetic or even a taste-based element. Each of these shows a variant of a species or even a slightly different species of the same plant type. And what was so important to the Incas is what those different variations represented, not just for taste or appearances, but for survival. If you look back to the Irish and the Irish potato famine, you will note that what the Europeans brought from the Americas over to Europe was the big, white, fleshy potato. And that was certainly the one that has the most starch in it, the most calories. It's in some ways the most efficient to be used. But when the potato blight came, which was just a fungus that began to infect the potatoes, it wiped out almost all of them. In the Andes, amongst the Incas, this did not happen. And the reason why is because each of those species, each of those different colors of different types of potato and maize and quinoa had different forms of immunity to different diseases. And as a result, you would not get a single blight that wiped out an entire year's crop. The Incas also built elaborate storehouses along these road routes. You can see them portrayed here, and in these they would collect food from across regions and then redistribute them at times of need. Very elaborate, very successful form of redistribution based on a central power regime. Now, how do they keep track of all of this? Well, that brings us back to our record keepers that I mentioned before. The record keepers used a system called the quipu. Now, what the quipu consisted of was a series of colored strings knotted in very specific ways to keep a record of different items and things. Some people say that actually the quipu even developed into its own form of writing system, but whether or not that's true, I don't know. What we do know is that by using different colored strings and different types of knots in amongst all of them, they were able to keep very elaborate records as to where food was stored, what food was taken from what area, what population had done what form of road work, and so have an elaborate bureaucratic system for managing the empire, all based on strings and knots. Now, one of the things they kept track of during all of this was the construction things. And here you see Coricancha, which is a religious structure in Cusco. And you can see it's incredibly well made, but it was built by conscripted labor. That is to say, it was built by people who were brought in captives of the empire who put things together and built it into a central location. And they would do this not just in Cusco, but throughout the empire. They used similar techniques everywhere throughout the empire, but they did it in a most interesting fashion. What they would do is they would take populations and move them. Parts of the population they would take from all around the empire, throw them together, most of them not speaking the same language, and put them into pressed work gangs to do things like build roads, or build temples, or build administrative centers, or things like that. And this had a dual purpose. On one side, it showed who was in charge. On another, it built important public works. But in a third, it made people realize the extent of this empire that they were helping to build. Whether they wanted to or not is a different story, but surely it made an impact that these populations were part of a greater system, a system that was ruled by the people who were telling them from the top of the society how to build these roads. And of course, they couldn't talk to each other, so they couldn't have an uprising either. And then they'd be moved back to their own locations. Now, one of the most classic construction things they did was what's known as Machu Picchu, which was a religious and palatial estate. Its exact purposes we do not know, but in many cases it's seen to have been a sort of retreat for the elite class, particularly for the Sapa Inca, where they would go and hold important religious and political discussions, sort of the Camp David of the Incan world. And it was also constructed using this kind of construction, and it is extremely remote and extremely hard to get to. They had a variety of other integration strategies, ways to make their empire seem like an empire. One of them was that they moved entire communities from one place to another. People from the core of the empire, those who were not Incans, would be moved from where they lived out to the periphery, that is, the edges of the Incan Empire. Whole lock, stock, and smoking barrel, their whole villages, everything, moved from one location to another, and vice versa. So they'd move populations from their traditional lands to a totally new land where they didn't know what to do, they didn't know what the food sources were, and they sort of were required to rely upon the Incan leaders in order to tell them how to survive in this new territory. They also, as I said before, had marriage alliances between Incas and conquered groups, raising some of those conquered groups to quasi-Inca status. And this helped create a series of truly successful cases for the Incan Empire. The Incan Empire, at its height, governed about 6 million people across widely different social and environmental terrains with an extremely efficient and effective bureaucracy. But after having grown so quickly over 100 years, the Incan Empire was under stress. There was increased factionalism. Local populations still resented the conquest. The split inheritance system that was supposed to eliminate factionalism between sons created an eternal need for expansion to build new palaces and new estates in order to show power. And that meant that they had to constantly go and battle and conquer more territories. And of course, the further away they got, the harder that became. Just ask Alexander the Great. It also led to a civil war between the two brothers, Inca Huascar and Inca Atahualpa. So that split inheritance system clearly did not work so well because at this point they had a civil war between two fighting brothers, each trying to be the Sapa Inca. And at just this time, a smallpox epidemic occurred. That smallpox epidemic was coming in advance from down the coasts, from the northern zones, in advance of the Spanish population, for smallpox was a European disease. And so the population was sick, divided, and in a civil war when suddenly Pizarro arrived in 1532. Pizarro led a larger force of conquistadors than say, Cortez did, but he still led a series. It still was small compared to what they had. And when they came in, they saw what was going on and declared support for one of the leaders, for Sapa Inca Atahualpa. Now, this led Atahualpa to have a de facto victory by capturing his half-brother, Inca Huascar, who was either executed or died of smallpox, depending on who you talk to. But shortly thereafter, the Spanish imprisoned Atahualpa and demanded gold for his ransom. Now, they said the Incas must fill his throne room with gold. And so the Incas did, because the Incas had a lot of gold. But what the Spanish did was take hammers and hammer that gold down flat so that they had to keep bringing in more and more gold. They hammered layer upon layer of golden items until the room was filled. And then they killed Atahualpa anyways, because that's the kind of guys the conquistadors were. Now, that did not lead to an end or a total conquest. The battles continued on for a long time. There was a very successful guerrilla warfare portrayed against Pizarro and his conquistadors. But eventually he was defeated. And at least 9 to 14 million Quechua speakers still exist today. We talk about the Incas as if they're gone, but they're not. They still survive today. There are also at least 2 million Aymara speakers, plus other minority groups around. These are not all descended from the Incas, but many of them are, and most of them are descended from one or another of the indigenous groups that were still there. The Incas did not vanish, just like the Mayans did not vanish or the Aztecs did not vanish. The Incas live there today. Now, here is another good time for you to probably take a break, get a breath of fresh air. We're going to go on to North America and what happened there. But I'm just going to keep talking because that's the kind of guy I am. Press pause if you want to. I'll give you 3, 2, 1. Okay, I'm back. So, we've talked a lot about the great civilizations of the Aztecs, the Mayans, and the Incas. But we haven't talked much about what goes on in North America. Now, if you look at most images of pre-Columbian North America, what you end up with are images of a much more primitive, quote unquote, population. But that is not wholly fair, nor is it true necessarily. The North America had its own larger scale civilizations as well, and we're going to discuss this. Now, this map, the one I'm showing you here, shows just some of the First Nation groups that are believed to have existed at the point of contact, and more or less where they were located. It also shows some shared general cultural groupings and different regions within that. But the reality of what was going on was much more complex and much more elaborate. However, we do not have time to discuss North America as a whole. Instead, we're going to focus on the Mid-East of North America. That is the areas between, say, the Rockies on the west and the Appalachians on the east, and focusing primarily along the Mississippi River Basin. Now, in the eastern United States, we have a different series of cultural things. We have the early woodland period that includes the Adinas. We get the middle woodland period that includes the Hopewells, which is that image I just showed. Now, the Adinas, I should say, were hunter-gatherer societies with some ceramics and long-range trade and exchange networks, and they used mound-built earthworks. The Hopewell of the Middle Woodland period, that is 100 to about 500 AD, included exotic trade, more elaborate mound building, and increased populations with increased sedentism. And then comes the Late Woodland period, which is also referred to as the Mississippian period in this area, and that involves even more greater amount of sedentism and larger scale settlements. Now, initial subsistence in North America, going back in time, shows that domestication of different animal and particularly plant types began in the Archaic period. Now, there's no evidence of population pressure or environmental stress to do this. Domesticates at this point remained a very small part of the diet, and they did so for over 1,500 years. They didn't really affect local lifestyles. Most of the time, the population continued simply eating and subsiding off of hunter-gatherer techniques. But these early domesticates are seen as having supplemented their diet. Maybe some of these were experimenting with the same plants. Maybe there were multiple domestications that occurred back and forth. We don't know. But the point is that this was not the core of their diet. This was a supplement to their diet. And some of the early domesticates included goosefoot, which is a very nutritious food, marsh elder, which is sort of the North American equivalent of quinoa, and sunflower, which was very, very rich, very healthy for you, easy to grow, and could also be fed to other domesticates such as birds. Now you can see in this picture the difference between the wild and domesticated each of these, and you'll note how the domesticated grow larger and larger as they get more domesticated. The initial wild forms are much smaller. That is the key of any domesticate versus any standard wild growing animal or plant. Now, here we see the growth of the different cultures. We have the Hopewell culture up there in the Northeast. You have the Adena culture starting with that tiny little dot, and indeed you also have the Mississippian or Cahokia culture, which is that large zone right there. Now, early woodland period saw an intensification of local cultigens. At around 500 BC, you get an investment on farming with more domesticates, and you get a rise of a population known as the Adena culture. Now, the Adena culture lived in seasonal camps. That is to say, they lived in camps where they would move from summer to winter to winter to summer. They were primarily hunter-gatherers, and as said before, they subsidized their diet with early domesticates. They had large exchange networks, and that was what particularly interesting, that went over wide regions. The reasons for that we're not quite sure, but we think that perhaps in part it was there to help create relations back and forth in case of times of need. That if one group was running short on food, they had good relations with another, they might be able to get food from that group. That's just one theory. But they also built earthworks. Some were flat for ceremonial areas, and others were burial mounds with enclosure ditches. Now, the Adena burial mounds were curvilinear, that is to say that they were round. They were large. They often covered areas of over 100 meters, that's over 100 yards. They had enclosure ditches around them to make sure that there was a difference between the area of the mound and the area outside of the mound. And they often had multiple burials in each, often in wood-lined tombs. Now, sometimes those tombs were left open, and later bodies were included later. But mostly what would happen is they'd build one mound, and they'd put a tomb in it, and they'd cover that up. And then later, they'd build another tomb and cover that up with even more dirt, and sort of have these stacked layers inside the burial mounds. And this shows you the overall range of the Adena culture. You can see it here growing in this zone here. And Hopewell, you'll note, which is the following period, is the red, much farther reaching zone, whereas the Mississippian is focused more along the Mississippi Valley and then down into the southeast quite a bit. But the Adena culture was starting here, and then the Hopewell culture moved out beyond it. Now, the Hopewells, that is the group that followed the Adenas, had an intensification of native cultigens, and maize was introduced, that is corn, at about 100 AD. But it's not a major part of the diet at that point. Wild plants and animals were still very, very important, but they were no longer the primary source, or that is to say that it was about a 50-50 split between cultivated plants and wild plants and animals. Maize was a small part of the diet there, but the other native cultigens had become more important. They also had burial mounds, not quite as large, but put out in more elaborate layouts. And they also had effigy mounds. Now, it's these effigy mounds that drew the attention of many early American archaeologists and anthropologists, because they saw things like Snake Mound here in Ohio Valley, which was elaborate and huge, as you can see, and this monkey mound. I don't know what it's really supposed to be, but it does look a bit like a monkey. Also in the valleys. But what was particularly interesting was that the American anthropologists and archaeologists could not imagine that these were built by the quote-unquote savages they were seeing at the time. And they came up with all sorts of theories as to how they were built. Some said that they were Viking invaders. Others said that it was St. Brendan from Ireland. Many said it was the lost tribes of Israel, and there's many religious groups still today that tie into this. However, excavations have shown rather definitively that these were in fact built by the Hopewell populations, who were the ancestors of the Native Americans who they found living there later. There's also historic records to back that up, which we'll get to. Now, when I spoke of the mounds before, I said they were built in complexes. And here's an example of that. You can see that these burial mounds were planted in complexes with large enclosure zones around them, and sometimes with the different effigy mounds inside. These mound complexes often contained numerous burial mounds. They were usually geometric in shape and often laid out in geometric patterns so that you could see, like, for example, the four mounds here at the square patterns, each at the entryway of a central point, things such as that. Now, if the Adena had a wide-ranging exchange network, the Hopewells were even larger. They had goods that spread from all across the North America. They had shells from the Gulf of Mexico. They had shark teeth coming in from the Atlantic coast. They had mica goods coming up from the southern United States. They had quartz coming from downriver in the Mississippi River. They had copper and silver coming out of Canada. They had Knife River Chert, which is an extremely good form of lithic, makes for very good tools, coming out of North Dakota. And from the Rockies, they had things such as grizzly bear teeth and, in fact, obsidian, which obsidian, as I may have mentioned before, is the perfect form of lithic tool. It fractures down to the molecule. It is volcanic glass, and so it is extremely sharp. They even had evidence of salmon coming from the Pacific Northwest. And some of the trade items they had involved copper, which they would hammer out and cut into fine, detailed things or make into axes. Now, copper axes are not particularly useful. They're too soft to be used really against wood or much of anything, but they do make for very fine looking items. So prestige goods, really. The mica they had was carved into elaborate patterns, which are, if anybody's worked with mica, knows that's extremely difficult to do. And they had a culture based around pipes. Now, pipes were prominently featured in elaborate burials, possibly associated with maintaining an exchange and relationship networks. These were pipes that were usually made out of soapstone, sometimes jade. They were polished down and usually in an animal form of some form or another, and smoked out of primarily tobacco. Here you have another one. Now, eventually, the Hopewell system collapsed. Now, collapse, we love using the word collapse, but is it really a collapse? We don't know. There are different reasons why they think that the Hopewell system stopped. One of them was that the cultivation that was being used was so successful that it no longer needed or economically supported these long-distance exchange networks. If you remember when I said that sometimes they thought that exchange networks were there primarily to create supplements of food networks in times of need. Well, if there are no times of need, the need to keep these elaborate exchange networks going no longer holds true. Others argue that there might have been increased friction or conflict that disrupted exchange at the interregional or intra-regional level. That is to say, that there's infighting back and forth. We don't have huge amounts of evidence of either one, but they did seem to exist. So that is a possibility. Well, what followed on eventually after the Hopewell period is the Mississippian period, which goes from AD 1000 to 1500. Note that end date. Now, the Mississippian population was an agrarian economy. It was based primarily on the growth of vegetables. It was agriculturally based, primarily focusing on maize, that is, corn. And unlike the previous areas, you start getting, instead of having population centers, you start getting proto-urban and early urban centers. In fact, you eventually get places like Cahokia and Moundville, which are, by anyone's definition, an urban zone. Now, the Mississippian period saw the construction of monumental architecture, huge earthen mounds. You can see some of them portrayed here. This is a computer-generated image over on the right, which doesn't do much justice until you realize how big those buildings are supposed to be. If you look over on the left, you see a much better image of it where you can see oak trees being portrayed, and those are mound structures throughout representing the location of different elite palaces and temple structures in this location. Now we're going to focus primarily on Cahokia, which is outside of St. Louis and has an amazing cultural background to it. In AD 1150, so around about one of the Crusades, there were as many as 20,000 people living in Cahokia. And here you see an image of what that city would have looked like. You see the populations around the outside. Those are all habitations. You see that sort of circular zone with a big Styx around it. That was a ritual site, it's believed. There is burials under there. You also see all these enclosures and that big central enclosure where there's a large ritual zone and what is believed to have been a chieftain's palace up on top of that large central mound. That's called Monk's Mound. And you see over here, Woodhenge is that round structure you saw before. Monk's Mound is absolutely enormous and shows how the population was spread out. Mound 72 is a burial mound where there was an amazing series of what's called the Birdman burial with a falcon cloak laid out. Look it up, it's beautiful. But you can see on here the timeline of how it developed. In 600 to 800 AD, it was first occupied. In about 900 AD, you began to get a settlement hierarchy. That is to say that you began to get differentiation between elites and normal people living in the village. At AD 1050 to 1250, you had its maximum population, and then after 1350, you see it begin to decline. Now this is Monk's Mound, and to give you an idea of how big Monk's Mound is, it's a little hard to tell because if you look at the steps there, that looks big, but each of those steps are actually a series of steps going up and then a large flat. If you look at the car in the foreground, that gives you a much better idea of how big Monk's Mound really was. And you can see how it was divided into different levels with different levels of access for different levels of leaders going back up and forth. Here you see a better picture of it as a whole, and it is estimated that 30 people filling 8 55-pound bags of dirt a day would take 167 years to build Monk's Mound. Obviously, it was done probably by more people than that, but it gives you an idea of how many person hours it took to build this enormous earthen structure. Now, around Monk's Mound and around the central portion of Cahokia, not all of Cahokia, but around the central portion of Cahokia, there was a palisade that was made of 20,000 logs. And it was rebuilt at least 3 different times. And there's no doubt that this palisade was a defensive structure. It is clearly built as a defensive structure. And throughout Cahokia, you have a wide range of very elaborate pottery and soapstone images that are made of very fine ceramic quality. But eventually, in 1350 AD, the population declines around Cahokia, and it's abandoned totally 50 years later by AD 1400, plus or minus, long before European contact. Now, various theories suggest why this might have happened. There was internal conflict is one, that there was an overthrow of the elites. A popular uprising came up and got rid of these people who were suppressing the proletariat. But there's really no evidence from this site to support that. There's evidence from other sites around the Mississippian culture, but nothing in Cahokia suggests a popular uprising. Some people say that there was an external conflict, that they were invaded from the outside. But again, there's no evidence to suggest this. Normally, when you see an invasion, you have large burning elements that show up very clearly in the archaeological record, but we don't see any of that, other than the presence of a palisade, but the palisade does not appear to have been destroyed. Warfare was common at the period. We do know that. There's no question about that. We see people who die from that kind of thing, but there's nothing suggesting that Cahokia was invaded. Then there's the ever-present environmental reasons, that the overuse or destruction of food or construction of other resources helped destroy the viability of the land. Some evidence is used to suggest that there was regional flooding at that time, but we don't really know for sure. And others suggest that there's a spread of disease by urban proximity, not coming from Europe, but just by the fact that you had large populations living together. In the end, we don't really know what happened. What we do know is that around 1350, Cahokia itself began to be abandoned. And that led to the late Mississippian decline. All these cities around the area, up and down the Mississippi Valley, began to fall out of use. Yet many remained in place and were still flourishing up until the point of European contact. Indeed, early French explorers and ethnographic accounts describe going into these vast cities with these vast mounds. And they tell us about how these people were living. In fact, a lot of what we know about how they lived comes from these early accounts. But within a generation, those cities were gone. And we do know what happened there. The Mississippian culture, the last elements of it at least, were destroyed by widespread disease, such as smallpox and the like, after contact with Europeans. This is all written down by European ethnographers, primarily in French records. And one of the reasons why the early American archaeologists did not understand this or discover this is because they were written in French, and so they were not being read. And so that brings us very quickly to the last comment, which I've made before. There are no pack animals in North America. The horses that we associate with Native Americans bravely riding pintos and the like across the battles did not exist. They had escaped from Spanish and French and later English populations. They were a much later invention. In South America, in the Andes, there were llamas and alpacas. Alpacas are primarily wool breeding creatures. They have they weigh about 150 pounds, cannot carry very much, but they have very fine fleece that can be shaven. Llamas can carry they weigh about 400 pounds and can carry about 100 pounds of weight pretty easily. They're also very aggressive and make great defensive creatures for guarding the rest of your fleet, your flocks. But regardless, both of these were found primarily in the very high altitude zones of South America. So when you hear people talking about why didn't the Americas have more elaborate cultures and civilizations, first of all, you'll see that they did. And secondly, you'll see that they had no beasts of burden by which they could plow fields, move things, move large amounts of food from this place to that. And that in the very place where they did have such beasts of burdens is the least likely place where wheels are going to be developed because of the nature of the terrain they're dealing with.